great deal of problems to me. For one thing, by putting the in front, I've defined the article, and by putting an and between, I'm having to make a differentiation between a map and a diagram. I hate talks that begin with Oxford English Dictionary definitions, but I have recourse to do exactly that, I'm afraid. Here's one of my contradictions. A map I take to mean a representation, I'm paraphrasing the Oxford English Dictionary here, the Earth's surface or a part of it. It also maps political, physical, and other features. What is interesting is the second definition, which is that it is a circumstantial account of the state of things, a representation in epitome. I think that's probably the chord that underpins the talk. A circumstantial account of the state of things. The diagram is a figure composed of lines serving to illustrate a statement, or it is an aid in a demonstration. It can be the general scheme of an object. It also may represent a course of actions or process. Sometimes it's a musical scale. We'll see that the diagram can inhabit the map because it has a pedagogy to it. It begins to tell. So when it is in the map, it starts to speak of things, of ways of reading the map or the conditions of the map. The initial bit of the talk focuses on the map. The diagram enters it inadvertently. But later on in the talk, there's a whole lot of slides to go through, so I shall rattle through them quite quickly. The later bit of the talk will actually entertain the diagram again, and we will end with the map. Why did I pool the map and the diagram? Well, it's caused a bit of a nightmare. The reason I first proposed to pool these two things together was the flatness of the image. The whole direction of these talks was a relationship of the image to the support. My thought about the map and diagram was that the image would be congruous with the support, that there would be no separation between the image and the support, that it would be flat. However, looking at various maps, as I have been doing in the last week quite a lot, it's clear that it's a more complex problem than first imagined. But in essence, I was right, that a map is something you take away with you. A map has objectness to it, and one appreciates it, usually as a flat piece, although we'll see Inuit carvings are not necessarily flat, and maps can be constructed in relief in 3 dimensions. But essentially, it's the objectness of the image of map that I was talking about, if that makes any sense, objectness of image. What I want to do initially is to consider the relationship of the map to its object, to the world that it represents. Borges, in one of his pithy articles in the Book of Sand, proposes that the empire's cartographers made a map on a 1-to-1 scale of the empire. Every rock, every blade of grass was exactly duplicated and represented within the map. And the map was laid over the empire. What happened to that map is that the world itself altered that map. The winds that blew through the world, the physical environment changed it, and it was blown to all fragments of the empire. The sun bleached it. The wind destroyed it. And all that was left were the tatters of a map. Lewis Carroll also takes on this problem of the 1-to-1 relationship. Actually, I've given the game away a bit. It's my problem with telling jokes and things. I tell the end result first. In an article called Sylvie and Bruno Concluded, he writes, "There's another thing we've learned about your nation, said Mein Herr." I think that's Bruno talking. Map making. but we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? I replied, I think I is the Sylvie, about 6 inches to the mile. Only 6 inches, exclaimed Mynheer. We've soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile. And then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to a mile. Have you used it much? I inquired. It has never been spread out yet, said Mynheer. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map. And I assure you, it does nearly as well. The nonsense poem reveals quite a bit, as all nonsense poems do. That the map itself is a tool. That the map is not the world. And that its connections to that world need to be tested and contested. It's the site of many influences. And we will try and unpick those influences. It deals with space, clearly. And here I'm sailing close to the wind. Space, it seems to be, is the new intellectual frontier. It has been mapped, charted, decolonized, colonized. Travel is not a mere hobby anymore, but an intellectual operation. I, using the metaphor advisedly, plot the direction of this talk close to the winds, blowing through the critical practices. And I'm fearful of my navigational skills and perhaps the idiocy of the project. The idiocy of the project. What I propose to do is try to thicken the map. Not in a sense of physically making it something heavier, but thicken the concerns of the map. It's what the ethnographer would, a term from ethnography. The thickening is the idea that it's a set of complex perceptions and relationships. There are different viewpoints that inhabit the map. In some ways, our perception of maps is still that, if some of you came to the last talk, 2 talks ago, of the Renaissance, a geometricalized space, a space of truth, juridical and veridical. We could justify, and it is there as a complete truth. But maps are not this. They both express and unravel a complex set of relationships to place. Now, place is a problematic term as well, we should deal with. It's not anymore a pinned thing, a one-off, a thing we can know absolutely. Place, I think, becomes a more fluid thing, as we shall see when we analyze the notion of the field and the habitus. Maps express and unravel, I'm repeating myself, a complex set of relationships to place and the powers that produce, name, and own that place. It is not a cold, mechanical, and neutral fact. This notion of the objective gaze, which infuses our understanding of the generic map, needs to be tested. The world or locality mapped in the Renaissance time was pinned in the geometrics of a graticule. Remember we talked about the reticule in the past. Well, the graticule is a grid that is laid down horizontally. It is believed that the mechanical and the impartiality of the mechanical delivers a truth that is absolute to the map. We have the notion of a totalizing eye that would constitute the map. A detached and truthful eye. Nigel Thrift and Stephen Pyle write, the practice of visual representation of the map served to disguise the power that operates in and through cartography. Maps are not empty mirrors, that they at once hide and reveal the hand of the cartographer. Maps are fleshly, of the body and of the mind of the individuals that produce them. They draw the eye of the map reader. Maps are framed, marked with text, simplifications and fabrications. They raise to visibility behind the map, around the map, in the map, and they consign invisibility. The map does not simply itemize the world. It fixes it within a discursive and visual practice of power and meaning, and because it naturalizes power and meaning against an impassive and neutral space, it serves to legitimate not only the exercise of that power, but also the meaningfulness of that meaning. What we need to do is get behind the map. We need to get through the map. What we're dealing with is a perception, and we're dealing with space. And we're trying to fuse those two things. Here, I'm going to quickly, and I've just really encountered this, and I'm summing it up very quickly and doing probably not a very good job of it, but Bourdieu's notion of field is an important thing which we need to consider in terms of the spaces that lurk behind the map. Now, what is the field that Bourdieu talks about? It's a perceptual and political field. He considers it not attached to space. Later on, other philosophers and social theorists and cultural theorists start to place it exactly in space. But he sees it as a sort of political, perceptual, and social field. And he says that each field prescribes its own particular values and possesses its own regulative features, which agents struggle to change or preserve. It is a domain constituted in a set of relational and perceptual configurations. These are between positions based in certain forms of power. So what we have is the structure of the world. But what anchors this structure is a thing he calls the habitus. And this is a kind of embodied unconscious that the agent or the subject has. It becomes a strategy or generating principle, these are his words, enabling agents to cope with unforeseen and ever-changing situations. It's a system of lasting and transposable dispositions which, integrating past experiences, functions at every moment as a matrix of perceptions, appreciations, and actions, and makes possible the achievement of infinitely diversified tasks. What this is that inside this structure, it is ever-changing. We don't just think of the structure. There are agents within it that are pushing at that structure. The agents, us as individuals, social groups, forces that start to push at these limits, at these borders, which are the thing that the map is about. There are laws, but there are also people that are moving through those laws and rules. Lefebvre takes on this notion of the field and identifies it within space. And he identifies three dimensions of social practice in the production of space. The first is the material spatial practice. This can be constituted in many ways. This is probably another term for this he would call experience. But through this we have the flow of goods. We have ownership, we have other negotiations of material and substance and space, transport, communication, and so on. Then we have perception, or the representation of that space. This is map making and recording spaces within drawing, photography, and other systems. And then we have this he calls the perceptual space. Then we have the spaces of representation. This is the imaginative space. These are the spaces occupied by the media within political demonstrations and such like. They become our imaginative actions within that space. They move space on a bit. So really we can see that the map inhabits the perceptual dimension of his social practice. But it's not just a dialectic link between these things. They somehow move over each other. And considering one, it starts to shake and twitch the other. There are tensions between the material and spatial practice and our representations of those practices, and our spaces of representation of those practices. What is interesting in the latest thinking around space is that it has really three dimensions we might consider. There's a kind of neo-Marxist idea of the space with the flow of goods, flow of commodities, the economics of that space, and the political dimension of that space. Recently, that's been added to by the psychological dimension of that space, people like Wiedler looking at the architectural uncanny and such like. But there's also a social dimension to that space, which Inuit Rogoff and others have taken on. And that starts to talk of the dispossessed, the diaspora and the movement of bodies through that space. What we need to look at is, within the map, is the different fields around the map. And this will hang over the talk. I'll get onto the slides in a minute. I know I'm carrying on a bit here, but I'll try and get to the slides as quickly as possible. I know they start to inform it much quicker than I'm doing. When we consider the map, there is the world to be mapped, and that is constituted in a spatial field. There's mapping itself, and that has a tradition, a history, a political dimension to it. There is the mapper as an agent that works in the mapping that also can start to feed in, and we'll see when we look at the maps of the slides of these maps how we can negotiate a reading of it from these different perspectives. And the last thing is that there's a user to a map, that a map is used, and it's brought about, or it is directed towards its place of use. One can't separate that out from the map. What I'm going to do is show you some slides. Oh, that's not it. Oops, maybe I'm not. There you go. The first slide is one of the droodles from my book of droodles, which you saw when I showed the diagram that I thought might best establish the thinking for the talks. Map or diagram? The information is not full within this. And it seems that we need to think of the representations within a map. And I believe there's 4 levels of code within a map. There's the representation of the thing or events. They might be iconic or symbolic. Then there's the representation of surface and space, what Dennis Wood would call tectonic representations. And they are scaled or projected or topological analyses, etc. Then there are the linguistic codes of a map, names, classifications of ownership, and so on. And lastly, there's the presentational code of the map. It is the representation system of these signs, embodying in some way the stance and position of the map maker. Takes on some of the other kind of codes that might be the poetic codes, the aesthetic codes, the functional codes, and such like. This map, what does it represent? The information as yet is insufficient. We could make conjecture. It has location. It has a series of points, and in some way these points are related. Is this the loneliness of the performer? with the audience looking on? Is this a man on a beach whose friends have told their friends? Is this some sort of bacteria caught in penicillin? Is this a political rally? Many directions and meanings within the map. Most maps force reading, and we need to look at that notion that the meaning is forced towards some absolute reading. Whatever this drawing is about, it is composed outside its frame. It's composed, the meaning is composed by us, the user. Oh, I've done it again. I'm going for the wrong one. I put in this slide because suddenly we do have this view. We have the view of the god. We have the view of the bird that wasn't there for Renaissance artists and map makers. We now are able to photograph that world from that view, whereas they imagined it from that view. They worked within an imaginative dimension of map making. Just going to get on to this one. Oh, it's upside down. Never mind, it works both ways. This is a map by a South African artist called Mushekwa Langa. And in some ways, you probably might gather from the accent, I am located, I am positioned, I'm a product of a map. Pretty much the same map as Mushekwa Langa. I'm from South Africa originally. The first maps I encountered were purple, and they smelt of meths. They came off a roneograph. Probably most of you have never encountered a roneograph. They were presented within geography lessons with all naming taken off them. And in some way we had to remember, it was like a strange card game. Almost, you know that game, Pelmanism, where you turn over cards and you match two cards. My memory of a map is a memory of matching, of turning over cards and seeing if I get the right name in the right place. What lurks behind the name was never encountered. These were absolute truths. We had to match our decisions to a Phillips map. We didn't understand that there were political dimensions to the map that we needed to encounter. Here we were in South Africa with a particular regime, living in a place called Durban, named after Sir Benjamin de Urban, a British colonialist. We needed to understand a little more about our maps. The diffusionism, the idea of a Eurocentrism that percolated down to South Africa. Here we were English-speaking people within this place. And yet we understood our whole world from a Europe and a colonial perspective. And this inhabited the maps that we were dealing with. Mushekwa Langa's map accepts the veridical nature of the map as an underpainting. And then he puts on top of it a diagram. A diagram which talks, this map, just to give you the title of this, it's called It Came from Outer Space. And what it does is deal with the inner space and the outer space. In Salman Rushdie's sense, the inner space is the space of the orthodoxies, of the controlling powers. He's looking at the influences and forces that come from outside the map, off the map, the thing that the map does not deal with. There is a tunnel there that connects the black outer edge of the map. You can see it, it's upside down. written tunnel, connects the black outside edge of the map to the blue interior. A mode of escape, a way of burrowing in. The ambiguities of the image are there for us to understand. This map is one of Al Lorenz's maps. Man is obsessive about texture, about recording. And this allows me to bring in De Soto. And the idea that I want to bring through these quotes of De Soto's is this: that there is the outside of the map that we look at. We look at the map. But there's an inside. We're somehow doubly constituted in our vision. That we need to understand the inside of the map somehow, or what it relates to, the inside of the thing we're relating to, because we use it inside the view. And De Soto talks about this in a wonderful elliptical essay, and I would thoroughly recommend that all of you get hold of it. It's called Walking in the City. He says, to be lifted to the summit of the World Trade Center is to be lifted out of the city's grasp. One's body is no longer clasped by the street that turn and return it according to an anonymous law. Nor is it possessed, whether as player or played, by the rumble of so many differences and by the nervousness of New York traffic. When one goes up there, he leaves behind the mass, I guess it's a male viewer, he leaves behind the mass that carries off and mixes up in itself any identity of authors or spectators. An Icarus flying above these waters, he can ignore the devices of Daedalus in mobile and endless labyrinths far below. His elevation transfigures him into a voyeur. It puts him at a distance. It transforms the bewitching world by which one was possessed into a text that lies before one's eyes. It allows one to read it, to be a solar eye, looking down like a god. The exaltation of a scopic and Gnostic regime. The fiction of knowledge is related to this lust to be a viewpoint and nothing more. This is the distancing that we talked about in the Renaissance eye. There's another way of understanding the city, and that's by walking in it. And De Soto says, the ordinary practitioners live down below the thresholds at which visibility begins. They walk, an elementary form of this experience of the city. They are walkers, Wandersmanner, whose bodies follow the thicks and thins of an urban text. They write without being able to read it. These practitioners make use of the spaces that cannot be seen. Their knowledge of them is as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. The paths that correspond in this intertwining, unrecognized poems in which each body is an element signed by many others elude legibility. It is as though the practices organizing a bustling city were characterized by their blindness. The networks of these moving, intersecting writings compose a manifold story that has neither author nor spectator, shaped out of fragments of trajectories and alterations of space. In relation to representations, it remains daily and indefinitely other. In other words, it eludes representations. What I see in some practice, in architectural practice and in some art and design practices, is a use of maps in which the first view, the view of the Icarus, is used constantly. They are overlaid. The thickening of the map happens by layering structure, map over map. Now this can be a creative and a generating tool, but not if it camouflages the walker, not if it camouflages the view of the other moving through the city. Oh, what's happened? All of you crane your necks sideways. Actually, you'll find this out in Inuit art. It doesn't matter which way up they put their images. They laugh at the Westerner who starts to crane their neck this way and that way. And you'll see in terms of composing their maps, they're able to read images from any side. But this map, if it is a map, and I think the definitions are rather frayed and it's very hard to control what it might be, is a photographic time-lapse. It's called A Day in the Life of 3 Persons in 2 Spaces at Hourly Intervals. And what this is trying to move the map beyond the structure of the urban planner, beyond the gaze of the Icarus, down into the view of the walker. What we're doing is trying to inhabit that walking space. You judge whether it's successful or not. These are all going the wrong way around, have they? No, that's all right. This is an interesting map. For the life of me, I can't remember who did it. But it brings back the smell of the school days. The actions at the surface of the map, the blots and configurations he's playing off here against what they would actually be in the world. It is that other kind of realization of the difference between the truth of the world and the truth of the map. If the map is truthful, as we first thought, then what are those ink blots? Particularly if it's presented as an untainted map. Is there some huge apocalypse, some terrible notion that takes away the whole of East Africa and blots out bits of Europe and the old USSR? What's also in that map is colored territories that mark ownership and mark law and legislation. Mark Twain, in his writings, takes Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer on a balloon journey. I think they were going across the state line from, don't know which, Nevada into Utah. I may be getting my geography completely wrong. And Huckleberry Finn asked Tom Sawyer if they are in Utah next, if they are in Utah yet. And he turns back to him and he says, "No, we're not, because the ground is not pink." The idea of the codifications of a map are really important and what they mean. What does the pink ground mean in these particular maps? Well, they were about ownership. They were about dominion. They were about colonization. Pink traveled right around the world. It's the Commonwealth. Sun never set on the Commonwealth. This is Mercator's map of the world, published in 1569 and set the tone for all future maps. Here we can see that it is very much about ownership. You will see there countries without foreign possessions, without colour. The only things that are coloured are those that have ownership. They are the political powers within the world. They're the only ones worth the colour. Oh no. I'm sorry about this. I think it's going to continue in this vein. I'm sure I got them right. This is a map by Nordo and Oort, an art map. They are questioning the sense of ownership. They're questioning the idea of national identity and the kind of views that move through national identity. They're also questioning, I think, the community, the European community. Your rope, 100%. We have angst written over the Scandinavian countries. And of course, Britain is the great break against community. France is a farce. I don't mean that, it's not a personal view. And so on. We could go through it. A witty map that speaks of the views of the map maker, acknowledging, or the map makers, they're acknowledging their stance. It is composed in terms of the map maker. He's revealing, or they are revealing, that they are not absolute, that this is not some truth but a view. It exposes the map to that problem. This is a map by Jimmy Durham. What inhabits the structure is the agent, what we were talking about in de Certeau's idea of walking in the city. The agents that inhabit this map are given in the title. The movement and migration of people, including myself, my friends, Maria Teresa Alves, Godwin Matatu, Lazare Christie, and Luis Francia. What is plotted there are their independent travels. This becomes the diagram by which the map becomes personal property. And we are made privy to their exploits. I think all of us, the maps of our childhood, one aspect of the maps of our childhood, there seem to be two sides to maps in our childhood. One was the absolute map that was presented to us in the geography lessons. And the other maps were the maps of Robert Louis Stevenson and Treasure Island, and the maps that we made of the garden with buried treasure, the maps of the imagination. I think you can all guess whose map this is. This is David Lynch. It's his map of Twin Peaks. He had to make a geographical construction to convince, I think it was ABC Network, to take on the program. And the program was directed with this spatiality in mind, different locations. It's not a real map, clearly, because they used different locations in different places. But he needed the notion of the map. He needed the structure so that the narrative could move through the map. Narratives inhabit maps anyway. This is one of the earliest maps, 2300 BC. And guess what? It's a record of ownership. It is used for the government to levy taxes. The plot of land marked out is 3 acres. I'm not sure what the taxes on that were in early Babylonian times, but that's what it was used for. These are Inuit maps, Eskimo. The term is not politically correct, so we'll use it Inuit. These maps are of the coastline. How they were constructed is really interesting. Papanek in The Green Imperative talks of these particular maps and the Inuit ability to understand and contextualize the spaces they exist in. Their maps were not sort of composed through for visualization or through seeing. They were accurate, though, to an amazing degree. Satellite photographs evidence the accuracy of their maps. They were composed in the salinity of the sea, in the wind, in the smell, in the sounds of the landscape. Somehow their landscape was too white. There was no idea of horizon. But they were amazingly sensitive to the scale and the forms of their landscape. What you have here is carvings of the inlets around islands and the mainland. They would be used at night while they were in their kayaks, and they would be felt and then turned around and carried on, and they'd negotiate their landscape in relating the feel of the map, to the feel of the movement through space. This is a 19th century palm stick sea chart. Seems like there were three kinds of maps: the portolands, the ones of sea charts, which the Eskimo map might be thought to be the ones of the land, and then the ones of the imagination. And there's overlap between them. This map shows the wave fronts and the currents and the curved sticks. The shells within it are little islands and island groups. This is a 500-mile area around the Marshall Islands. Here's a map which is not about its attachment to some kind of truthful objective world. This is a T&O map from Hereford, 1290, I think it was done. And in it is represented mythical and Christian narratives. The old mythologies, not mythical in the semiotic sense. In it there's we can't really see, but there's Noah's Ark. There's a man whose ears can be worn as clothing. A strange map. It's where we get orientation from. In the T&O maps, the Orient was on top, Europe to the left and Africa to the right. Jerusalem is directly in the center. It's more a kind of reading, a religious reading. I'm going to try and rattle through. Here we go. Another T&O map, which is again divided in the same split as shown before. Oh no. All right, let me try and deal with these. I don't know why this has all happened. This map I'd like to deal with because its representational systems are really interesting. It doesn't particularly matter about its orientation. This is a Spanish map attributed to Hernando Cortés, and it combines several systems of projection or representation. In the middle we have plan. We also have elevation, and there's a strange kind of unfurling into the elevation and the orientation of the outside perimeter of the city. It starts to unfurl sideways, and the elevation and the orientation of that elevation creates a kind of peeling or opening out. The boats, if you can see them, kind of read in many different ways. There's no kind of structural feature or scheme by which we can look at those boats in the right way up. So sometimes those boats are actually kind of falling out the water into the city. Right, we're back to the right way round. The next three slides are hopefully the right way round slides of a plan of Rome, or plans of Rome. This was probably done in the 13th century, the later part. It shows the city walls pretty much in the same way as the last map. There's a schematization of all the features in them. They're shown in different orientations, mainly in elevation. They're mainly in section. They're shown. This contrasts with this map, which is done in an oblique projection of Rome. It shows St. Peter's without the dome, so you have a temporal aspect to maps, and that is important, that one has a reading of time within maps. This is a similar view in which you do not see the dome of St. Peter's. So it shows you the representational systems that you employ, the plan or the oblique or axonometric projection, reveal different natures of the map. This map is a plan of Turgot, 1734, of Paris. Axonometric projections. A useful map to navigate in the city. The roads are exaggeratedly wide, so its use starts to dictate the kind of representational systems that one uses in the map. If the map did not exaggerate those roads, what would happen is buildings would be on top of each other and you would not see pathways through. So there are certain licenses and liberties taken by the map maker who defers to the user. This is a personal image map. This is not taken as a projection. This is done by a 12-year-old kid of Cambridgeport. I'm going to show two maps. They are two little boys' maps of their hometown. This is used by cartographers to see how people give back information. So in a way, this is a map for map makers, so they can see how people construct their own environments. This is the other map of the same town. They have all gone sideways. Actually, most definitely I put them sideways. I do apologize. This is Lake Garda and the Adige Valley, part of a picture map of Verona and its district, mid-15th century. It's a detailed plan of Verona and accurate mountain outlines of particular interest. What I'm trying to bring up in this next section of the maps is the notion of relief, or of a topographical relief within the maps. That these become really important in demonstrating places to cultivate or to climb and so on. The notion of the relief is present in the city plans, in the axonometric projections, but within charts, the flattening of the plan start to limit kinds of information, and there are different ways of dealing with relief. Where's the relief in this map? This is a map of Casablanca. And in this map, the different building types are classified by color. What you have is wood or steel frame buildings demonstrated by a different color. The height of each building is given by the tonality of the color. So the codification gives the relief. It's not immediately readable without you knowing the code. The darker tones are over 6 stories, the lighter ones are down to 1. This is a landscape of California by Irwin Rice. He calls this a morphographic or landform map. What he does is take notation of the aerial photograph and use these notations to demonstrate relief or to give relief within the map. This is a map that is actually made or formed out of plastic over a model of the surface and then photographed. So the shadows start to give you, we got that? Oh. The shadows start to give you the relief. The only problem is if you've got a plateau, it doesn't evidence itself, but then you wouldn't want to give relief to a plateau. This is another map in which, again, it's the other way around. I'm sorry about that. The sciography, the shadows that inhabit the map, are giving you the relief, but also the times of day. The shadows at the times of day are also within that map. This is a map by of Seattle. It's from the Department of Community Development. A series of maps that show a zooming in center of the map. It's almost like one of those letters back home when you give your address and then you go on to say the country and such like, universe, outer space, etc., etc. We can see we're coming in. The center of the map is Denver, was Aspen, Colorado. Public information map, and then we're coming in, and eventually we're into Colorado. Into Aspen. These maps are about routes, about roads that one would use in maps. And here, the geographical features are mainly taken away. They're just the historic monuments that this route would encounter that are revealed. So it's actually what is put here is the walk, not the place through which you walk. It is the procession that becomes the map. This is a route map, a ceremony of the procession of Her Imperial Highness the Empress Elizabeth from the Kremlin Winter House to the Ammenhof Winter House, 1742. We can see the particular journey through the courtiers and the attendants of the royalty. I'm going to try and rattle through. This is a medieval road map done in strip form, following some of the same kind of notion as the previous one. The idea that the route itself becomes important and inhabits the strip. These are all over the place. This is a pictographic map of the Mexico City Metro and the National Zoo, how to get there, and the isotype, the condensed bit of information, the iconic thing showing the event, that is one of the things we talked about, the representational systems, is reduced to an understandable form where you do not need language to deconstruct it. You can see where the gun is, the eagle and such like, and it starts to make information within the map much easier to interpret. This is one of the more famous maps or diagrams. Now that's interesting because it's not about geographical features but about the way to use those features. This is Beck's initial sketch of the London Underground. Again, I think I've got this the wrong way around. What we have here is a map by Simon Patterson where he starts to play on the taxonomies within the map, the naming that goes on within the map. He introduces different paradigms of mapping. He introduces philosophers or explorers within the map. It actually makes us question our normal way of naming place. Go to Chicago and you will be directed from Schiller Street and they will call it Goethe Street. And somehow the primary meaning of the naming is disavowed within the map. We know it only as place. We do not know it in terms of the knowledge systems that construct that naming. Goethe Street, Goethe, of course. Monty Python's map. How to take your appendix out on the Piccadilly line. Normally a route, but what they try and do within this route is encounter the comic procession that might happen within the route. So somehow they are giving you, remember the Royal Highness and the processional route to the Winter Palace, what they're doing is constructing what you should do at various points within the procession from Hammersmith to Holborn. Wash your hands at Piccadilly Circus. These are maps become diagrams. Somehow our familiarity with map can be used to demonstrate other things about the map. These are maps that are used to demonstrate various forms of colour blindness. Because we're so used to the Piccadilly line being that deep blue, we're able to see how a colourblind person would see that particular line. Oh, wrong again. The growth and change of London from 1840, 1860, 1880, 1900, 1914, 1929, reading sideways. Maps give information, statistical information. That's when they become pedagogic or diagrammatic, when we see them in relationship to each other to show the population explosion of London. The consecutive map is what gives us the diagram. This map is again about route. It's the traffic movement and vehicle storage of Philadelphia. It almost looks like a tapestry. The stitching of routes is made through a series of arrows, and we can see the movements of the cars and the stationary cars, or the stabbed lines, and the dotted lines are the parked cars. This is a map where the code becomes all important. It's analog, it's an analogy to some kind of reality out there is all but exposed here. It's a reconstruction of a map of the 2nd century BC. It looks like a Paul Klee drawing or something. It's showing the mountain, rivers, and military defenses of an area in Southern California. One would need to know the code to understand this map. I'm going to race through a few of these because we're running out of time. Some of you may be able to read this map. It says they're Iraqi convoys. This was a war about maps. And somehow the way this war was sanitized was the fact that we never came out of the position of Icarus. The sun never burned our wings, and we never came down to the ground to see the charred bodies on Death Highway within the Iraq War. We only saw images of almost computer game imagery of maps with little dots exploding in them. This map is of Death Highway, I think it became known as. Oh, going backwards. I do apologize for this. Don't lynch me afterwards. This is a military map of Columbus, which shows areas of visibility. It's really interesting. Here's a map which is about showing, which shows where you are shown so that you may hide. It shows where the best places for the foxholes are. And where you may be seen. Each color area shows the level of visibility within the map. These are NASA pictures for the month of December 1979 to 1990, demonstrating the erosion, I suppose you would call it, of the ozone level over the poles. Another weather map. This is the hurricane of 1987, October 16th. Hit southeast England. We can see the force of it traveling up into Scandinavia.
Could we just have England pointed out?
Yep.
Or London, first of all?
London is underneath one of those cotton wool clouds. That one.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I've got it.
Oh, there we go. All right. I don't think we need. I think everyone saw that, didn't they? Do I need to use my pointer stick? London. Map combined with diagram. The last-minute flight of 007, the Korean airline, an explanation of the circumstances of that flight. September the 1st, 1983, shot down off the coast of Hokkaido by a Soviet Su-15 fighter, killing all 269 passengers aboard. The Russians claimed it was a spy plane. The route and detail of the encounter are shown in this diagram, which combines the action in the sky with the geography of the area below. It was later proved that the KAL flight had strayed much farther off course than this map shows. Oh, my goodness. This is both diagram and map. What is combined here is an attempt to combine geography with history. A synchronological and a chronological chart. We'd get this in the back of picture atlases. But these themselves were very much biased and prejudiced. They were still about a Eurocentric view, and that really the histories of the other places were constructed very much in mind with how we touched those other places, with we being a European or Eurocentric politics or disposition. Series of diagrams. Here, the actual thing itself, the logic circuit of the computer, and the electrical circuit are absolutely one and the same thing. In reality, it is diagram, and its diagram is no more than its description. I talked about the pedagogy of a diagram. In some way, the arrow and the index finger become the important thing of the diagram. The idea that you are showing someone how to do something, or themselves, or of objects of the world. This painting by A.R. Penck reveals exactly that.
If you go back, I'll do that right for you.
The right way around. Okay.
Are you happy with it?
Yeah, I'm happy with that. This is these are some very interesting diagrams by an 18th century intellectual and academic called Robert Flood. And what he does here is the diagram is constructed as a homology. It is related to musical, it relates the cosmogony to a musical instrument. And this is a monochord that runs between the alpha and the omega from the beginning to the end. In some sort of contradictory way, it's thought of as a double monad, the idea of God being one and the same in two places at once, but the individual. This is almost like this is a block diagram. It is the Kabbalah. It maps the spiritual to the material. It is a map of geometry, if you like, but a geometry that can be taken to the figure or a tree or a mythical program or philosophical program. The top triad with the wonderful mystic names, if you've never encountered the Kabbalah, Keter is the hollow crown, Dart is the invisible container, the invisible sephirot of knowledge in the middle of it. And what we have is four different worlds that inhabit this diagram, which are, as I said on the right, a world of emanations, a world of creations, a real world of formations, and a world of making. Very interesting diagram. I'd like to go into it further, but I haven't really got the time. Here's a drawing by Robert Flood. And again, we visit the eye that I showed you on the first time. I seem to be obsessed by it. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We move into the iris. That is again reflected in the second figure, where we move into the form of the head. We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The bottom feature is a very peculiar diagram, a peculiar image within this diagram. What we have is an eruption of a cloud, and this is, in a way, the birth of matter. There's water droplets, there's air, there's fire, and there's the fecal matter of Earth that explode from this. In some ways, it's a descent through the sun from the one eye at the top. It's another diagram of Robert Fludd, which is the spiritual mind. We can see in the top vestibule of the mind, I think it's called I don't know what we call it, vestibule. We have intellect, rationality. What we have on the left-hand side is the senses and the sensibilities, the idea of earth, water, light, and air forming those sensibilities. We have it attached, we have a series of attachments to the world's intelligence. We have our own central intelligence attached to this. This is the last, probably Robert Fludd was the last thinker that thought that we could explain it all. And this is his attempt to explain the relationships between all things in the world to the way we think about them, cognitive systems. I return to that diagram, which is the notion of the mechanical mind, kind of clangers of the mind, that we somehow still have this vision of the world as a series of operations, and the mind as a series of operations and compartments of action that are quite mechanical, factory-like. Upside down diagram again, it was done that way around. The bottom image just shows you the levels of them, the different ways you could explain the same thing. This is about how we see. The first one is a descriptive symbol. It uses homologies, it uses the light bulb, it uses the battery, and it uses the switch to show how we're seeing. The middle one is about function and is codified within resistors and capacitors and switches. And the top one is a block diagram. Might as well go through them all here, Peter. There you go. So it just shows that the diagram can offer as description, as a set of symbols, and as a construction within blocks and flow charts. A diagram of the water, hot water and the cold water services within a house. We've taken away walls and we see them schematically connected to these descriptions in the house. What is happening here is you've got the facilities described, and you have the piping almost as a flow chart that exists between these facilities. All other information is taken away. Various descriptions of seeing. We revisit the camera obscura as a kind of diagram of the eye and the way we see of the mechanical. And then we see it again in terms of the way R.L. Gregory constructs the way we see as a block diagram, that it happens that we have input bottom-up sensory signals, what happens in terms of stimulus to the retina, which is informed by downwards symbols of our structures of knowing about how we see, which are then somehow organized around sideways rules of behavior, of construction, schematizing them. So there's a dovetailing between what we know and what we see, and this is an output to behavior. Here's this drawing by Marcus Wrights, which in some ways the drawings on the right describe the transformations that are happening within his images on the left, although they may not be strictly true. They may be just poetic. But here we have the idea that these pinched visual rays, we have this eye seeing the other eye going to the ear, we have the idea the eye becomes pencil, and I suppose the ones on the left in some way relate to them. All the transformations that happen to them within seeing relate to the diagrams on the right. Another diagram, three-dimensional construction of color, showing the the X, Y, and Z axis are important because we need to describe hue, value, and chroma. Within this, the idea of the intensity of the color, the tonality of the color, and the hue of the color, the actual name of the color. This is a diagram that's laid over a drawing in order to understand it compositionally. This is Juan Grie's drawing, where its construction is shown as diagram. It is a net that's laid over the world, if you like, or laid over another image.
Could you just go back? Which is the Juan Gris?
Neither of them are. They're construction. They're various constructions. The first one is trying to show the axonometric projection of Grie's picture, that it is constructed. The table is an axometric projection, and then the actual objects that are on it are vertical obliques. The second one, I think, is beginning to concentrate on the attachments to it, the actual abstractions that are being placed on the figure from outside to construct it. Although the information is not too dissimilar between the two readings of those. I think the one on the right shows the invisible planes. It gives you the dotted line. Sorry?
Who did that?
This is analysis by Dewberry and Willits of the Juan Gris. This is I'm going to have to wind it up. This is a slide, last one, and it's a good one to end on, is a catastrophe machine, which I'm afraid perhaps the upside-down slides have been. What the catastrophe machine is it's a description of a mathematical problem, of a mathematical, an algebraic formulation which actually can't exist, cannot be explained, except this man Francis tries to explain it, G.K. Francis tries to explain it in these drawings and does so quite well. What is needed here is a operation within this figure to fully explain it. This catastrophe machine is brought, these surfaces are brought up to some kind of apparatus to further twist them, and thereby explaining a pure algebraic function. And I think there's something really wonderful in the poetry of that idea that the image can provide a visualization of a thing that is purely mathematical and theoretical. I do apologize for the upside-down slides. I thank you very much for being with me for at least this lecture, and some of you for the other 4. We have to go because there's another lecture, so thank you very much.